All right, hey Tony, welcome back to the show.
Good to see you again.
Um, what are the new developments in the Scientology world? I've been following your Twitter feed, and this is one of the parts of your work that I admire is that you cover it constantly. It's like a daily beat, and so it really gives the reader, me in this case, a feeling of Scientology, the Church of Scientology, as this like living, breathing animal. It's not like a story that you once cover and you're done. There are new things happening. It's like a small country with its own political intrigues and allies and enemies turning allies, and the other way around. Um, so maybe I have a couple of things that I saw that I wanted to ask you about in sort of recent developments, and one is this kind of enemy turning ally, turning enemy type thing with Marty Rathbun. So for me, a person watching just a documentary, it's like you watch one documentary, you watch another documentary, you start to recognize certain faces. And, in the third documentary, you kind of go, oh, it's that one guy who used to be high up in the Scientology and now he's a crusader against it. And then it turns out that he's not a crusader against it anymore. So can you tell me who Marty Rathbun is, what is his trajectory with the organization?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I try to take a long view of Scientology history because, as you say, I enjoy covering it day by day, and it's a moving story, it's an evolving story, and that's what's so fascinating about it. And then, stories are coming from all over the world. And if you go back in history, you see that there's always been, a real interesting sort of evolution with people who leave the church, particularly people that were in for a long time and held high positions of power. We often see people come out, make some statements about what they went through, and then you talk to them 6 months later and they have a very different story about it. It's, what people need to understand is Scientology is such a collection of conditioning that people go through. It takes years to get out of that. And some people can get through it pretty quickly. Like you look at somebody like Chris Shelton, who had an interesting career in Scientology and was interested in some, pretty significant posts. And he pretty much shook it off right away. And he's, so good at explaining how Scientology works and all that. Doesn't really seem to be suffering from the effects. And then there are other people, it can take 10, 15 years for them to really throw off that indoctrination and conditioning. And you'll see somebody come out and they'll be really gung-ho on exposing the church. And just a short while later, they've vanished. They don't want to talk about it anymore. I think there are a number of different reasons to that. And we have seen, there's no question that some people come out, make some noise, and then the church does what it can to shut them down. There's just no question. People like Vicky Asneran, for example, was the person who had Marty Rathbun's job before Marty Rathbun did. And she came out in the 1980s and was really challenging Scientology in a big way. And what did they do with her? She was suing the Church of Scientology. I'm going to be writing a story about this tomorrow, actually, that's going to have some really interesting detail. And Marty Rathbun and Mike Rinder, on David Miscavige's orders, convinced her not only to drop her lawsuit and settle with the church and stop talking about Scientology, but to betray her own attorneys.
How does that work? What does that mean exactly?
In other words, when somebody sues the Church of Scientology, there are only very few attorneys who are willing to take that on. They know just, Scientology's reputation for scorched earth litigation is very well earned. And there are very few attorneys that are willing to go through that. And she was working with a few of the best attorneys that were good at that kind of thing and brave. And then, when you take on a lawsuit like that, it's generally on a contingency basis where, okay, the attorney's going to work very hard for a couple of years to help you fight the Church of Scientology in the expectation that eventually there will be some large settlement. There'll be a big check that the person is paid, and the attorney will be paid from that. So the attorney works, they can work for years without getting a penny in compensation until they get that big settlement at the end. And what they did in Asneran's case is Marty Rathbun and Mike Rinder, as top Scientology officials, convinced Vicky to turn on her attorneys, sign a settlement, and cut her attorneys out of it, which is really fascinating because that's what some people are accusing Marty Rathbun himself of doing now. And Mike Ritter actually testified to this in a document that ended up in Marty Rathbun's wife's lawsuit. I know it's complex, it's crazy, but it's really fascinating to see that this kind of thing has happened in the past. So Marty Rathbun was, he was at one point the number 2 guy in the whole church. He was basically David Miscavige's fixer, enforcer. He was a ruthless guy. And he was put in the hole, the special prison that Miscavige made for his executives at the beginning of 2004 for just a few days. And Marty has said there was no way he was going to put up with that. And he escaped. He ran and he blew the base and left Scientology in the early 2004. He then vanished to such a degree that there were rumors online that he had died. But he resurfaced in 2009 after he was visited by Jason Begay, Amy Scobie, Matt Pesch. They all, told him about what was going on in the church. So
that's like other ex-Scientologists.
Other ex-Scientologists, right. Amy Scobie, Amy and Matt were, the first, and they got there, and Amy was talking about how her mother was being disconnected from her Bonnie Elliott story we all know now, thanks to Leah Remini. And that really moved Marty, and he decided, I can't just stay silent, I have to do something. And so then he started talking to the Tampa Bay Times, which was the St. Petersburg, and came out with a big special in the summer of 2009, and that's when Marty started his blog. And very quickly it became incredibly popular. And I said at the time, for a couple of years at least, Marty Rathbun's blog criticizing David Miscavige was the single biggest challenge to David Miscavige and the existence of the Church of Scientology. And I really believed that because Marty was literally pulling people out of the church just by writing a blog, because he was able to reach deep into the membership in a way that journalists like myself Scientologists are very good at ignoring a lot of what I write. It was very hard for them to ignore what Marty was writing.
Because he's not kind of the outside world.
They know his name.
Just recently
they knew his stature. They knew that if this guy is saying there's something wrong with Scientology, he's probably got a point. Well, I wrote a story recently, and you can find it at my website, TonyOrtega.org, where I describe the whole arc of that blog. It's really fascinating to watch Marty's evolution over time, because it wasn't very long after he began leading this movement that he started fighting with the people in it, and was uncomfortable with what he read by other people, and he was really kind of getting away from that role when he and his wife filed this lawsuit against Church Scientology in August 2013 for the harassment they were going through. It's a fascinating lawsuit, and both Marty and Monique were represented by attorneys Ray Jeffrey, Elliot Capuccio, and Mark Wiegand. And these guys, Ray had already been through a couple of really important lawsuits with the Church of Scientology, just done beautifully. The guy, it's really hard to fight the church for lawyers because the church tends to go not after the plaintiff, just after the plaintiff, but they go after the attorneys themselves. And Ray weathered that really well. The Rathbuns filed that lawsuit in August 2013. And after a couple of years, it was obvious that they were winning. I mean, Ray Jeffrey and his team were fending off all of Scientology's attacks, and they got this brilliant appeals court decision in November 2015, and they were in the driver's seat. All my experts tell me they were in the driver's seat. And 2 months later, Monique fired the whole legal team and then later dropped the suit. So ever since then, everybody's been wondering, what was that all about? Especially because the documents that they actually filed, they blame the attorneys. I say they because it has Monique's name on it, but if you know how Marty writes, it's pretty obvious that Marty was helping her write these documents. Ray's convinced of that, at least. That's what he said in court a couple of weeks ago in Texas. So ever since then, we've all kind of wondered what would motivate them to drop a winning lawsuit that was probably worth several million, if not $10 million. I mean, I'm hearing that from people very familiar with Scientology litigation. How do you just walk away from that? And not only do you walk away from that possible compensation, but by dropping the lawsuit, they lost the court protection. That they were under there was a court injunction against the Church of Scientology to leave them alone, and that's a powerful protection. I mean, if Miscavige started surveilling them again, they could easily haul Miscavige in, but they dropped that. And so then to add to that mystery, not too many months later, this past September 2016, at Rathbun's blog, where he had been criticizing Scientology and David Miscavige, suddenly he's just like viciously attacking Ron Miscavige over his book, Louis Theroux over his movie, my website, Jefferson Hawkins, Chris Shelton. I mean, it was just bizarre, and clearly in the attacks on Ron Miscavige and Louis Theroux, he was defending David Miscavige, which was just shocking to see. That was last year. Then this year, he started putting out these videos, very slickly made, professionally made videos, just viciously going after Lawrence Wright, Alex Gibney, Leah Remini, Mike Rinder. And so, we're all very curious, how could the guy that just a few years ago had a website that was making a real challenge to the Church of Scientology now be spending his time in a professionally made set of videos viciously attacking all the people who had supported him. So, I have said some things about that. I do know, as a reporter who's been covering that lawsuit from day one, I know some behind the scenes things about what has gone on. But I've never said that I know anything about whether there's a settlement or agreement. I don't know. Marty has said there's no settlement. I think it's possible to imagine that he's doing all this for no money. But then I look at something like the fact that I reported that he had given an email that Danny Lemberger had sent him to the church to use in litigation against Danny. Danny's an independent Scientologist. He's in Israel. He sued the church. He had sent an email to Marty about David Miscavige. An attorney in Tel Aviv in the courtroom, I have the transcript, said that he called Rathbun, and Rathbun sent him this potentially damaging email. So it's one thing to badmouth people that used to be, you were on the same side with, but to hand over an email to be used against another former Scientologist in a court case, you kind of wonder, would you do that without being paid for it?
So to me, it's almost starting to sound like it's not like a personal story of I have this court case that I'm trying to navigate and figure out, and I'm looking for a better result from that. It's like choosing sides. Picking. He used to be in Scientology, big, prominent member of Scientology, the second person in the church. He then turned against it. Again, not you said he disappeared for a few years, but then he became kind of a crusader against it.
Right.
And then now, from what you're saying now, it seems like he decided to go back. He's working with Scientology. He's
that's the question. Is he working with them, or is he doing this on his own? And, so he's got these very professionally made videos where, for example, he is attacking Leah Remini. The Church of Scientology is then taking those video, moments from that and turning them into advertisements. So I emailed Rathbun. I said, did you give them permission to do that? And are you being paid for it? And he didn't respond. But it's hard to believe that, he must be at least given them permission. So there's, I don't think Marty Rathbun has gone back into the Church of Scientology. I don't think that'll ever happen. But there's no question that, the Church of Scientology is now using his videos to attack Leah Remini, and apparently with his permission.
And what is his argument now? Like when you say attack Leah Remini, what is the attack? What is he saying?
Well, it takes a lot of different forms. I mean, he's watching these episodes and just, always claiming that Remini and Rinder are not sincere, that they're making things up, that it's all scripted, it's just not true. I've been on those sets. I've taped 2 episodes with them. I can tell you what their method is. They don't tell us what to say, And what's kind of interesting is that in some of these videos, he's made a lot of claims that directly contradict what he said just a couple of years ago. So it's almost kind of cartoonish the way he's attacking things. And many of us suspect that he's reading from a script, basically. Like, attack this, even though, because if you were, for whatever reason, unhappy with something that you used to be happy with, you would at least address that. You would say, in the past I said A, but this is the reason why I now feel B. But instead, he's just saying this new version of things that completely contradict what he said before without even just discussing it, which just means for whatever reason, he has decided that he's going to attack in ways that benefit the Church of Scientology. So it's, and again, this has happened in the past. There have been other people that have come out speaking very strongly about the church one way and then have changed. And it's always interesting to try to find out why.
So you're saying this is a story that has been played out before. So maybe instead of asking particularly about Marty, generally, do you see, like, the way I'm starting to think about Scientology, the metaphor that kind of just worked for me is I really see it kind of like a small country or something with its own government and its own relationships to other political entities and other kinds of entities, and a population whose life is defined and shaped by this system. And I'm thinking about, like, if somebody defected the Soviet Union in, I don't know, the 70s or something, or the 80s, there often is also a kind of a trajectory. I mean, people take different trajectories, but it's not difficult for me to understand somebody who, was fighting some system or decided to abandon a system, then wage a war against it, and then maybe you sincerely become disillusioned with whatever you now have instead of that system in which you've worked with, which shaped you to some extent. And in case with, like, when you're talking about a country, there can be a sincere sense of patriotism or something. That there's a culture in that country that you abandon, that you value, that was tainted by whatever you dislike about the system, but you still value. Is there a thing like that? Can a thing like that happen to people who go against Scientology after they leave? Is there, like, something valuable that they left there that they don't feel good about leaving or something?
Well, people leave for different reasons, but the people that have left, many of the people who have left in the last 10, 15 years have left specifically because of David Miscavige. And when they leave, they'll tell you that they still have affinity for Hubbard, they still like to audit. And many of them come out saying, okay, now I'm not part of that organization anymore. I'm going to go back to what I really like about Scientology. And they plan they announce that they're going to be doing independent Scientology on their own. I totally understand that, but it's also it's a temporary sort of position for a lot of them. And you go back a year later and talk to the people, and oh no, I gave my books away. I don't even need them anymore. Because once you're out of the organization, then you're free to read more and watch what you want. And you start learning not just about what Miscavige has been doing, but about L. Ron Hubbard and his history, and controversies about Scientology going back to 1950. And so often, you'll see, I mean, Mike Rinder is a perfect example. When I first interviewed Mike 5 years ago, he was, I mean, I've been talking to him before that, but when I first really sat down with him, he was still, talking about, he was still an independent Scientologist and was on OT5. That's not the case today. He doesn't. He's very open with his criticism of L. Ron Hubbard Scientology. So that's pretty common. And then there are some people that remain dedicated to Hubbard and the ideas of Scientology long after they've left the church. They're indies. They're very dedicated. And I thought it was interesting on the most recent episode of Leah Remini. When she first started this series last year, she was pretty vocal about how she was not going to talk about the beliefs. She just wanted to talk about the behaviors and the abuses. But of course, the beliefs are part of what makes it such the organization that it is. And so this last week, they really went into it. I mean, they really went into the indoctrination, the levels, the crazy stuff on OT3 and OT8, which I thought was brilliant. And then they brought on a couple of independent Scientologists, and I thought, and I've talked to them before. I met Yossi Chardi in Israel, and they're very nice people. But I think part of it was that Leah wanted to say, look, I can criticize the ideas at the same time I have respect for the people who still believe in it. Which I thought was a smart move on her part. And I count a couple of really good friends among the independent Scientologists, and I feel the same way, that I respect them as people. At the same time, they have to understand I'm going to criticize those ideas because, I mean, it's L. Ron Hubbard,
I have I printed out something that I saw on your site that deals with it a little bit. So this is a Scientology magazine, right?
Yeah.
Source. And this is an advertisement for what exactly? There's like a new base or something with. Is this real? Is my main question. Is this a Photoshop, or is there a device that once I get to a certain level, I can get to use like futuristic stuff to change my life in some sci-fi kind of way?
Yeah, there is a device like that. Have you ever seen those gyroscope things that you can get into, like a full body gyroscope?
Mm-hmm.
That's what that is, with some extra, like, an extra skin on it to make it look even better. But it's just a very simple device that turns you upside down. That's the Superpower building, and that was coming a long time. They broke ground on that building in 1992, I think, and they didn't open it until November 2013, more than 20 years later. They spent at least $80 million building this giant city block size building with 7 floors. But Mike Rinder has said they probably raised $200 million. It was a big fundraising. It was primarily a fundraising tool for Miscavige.
Okay.
And what Superpower is, well, in Scientology, there's a bridge to total freedom, and you're going up levels, and they get more and more expensive. Separate to that, there are a few extra bells and whistles that you can go through. A couple of them are called the L rundowns. They cost you $20,000 to $40,000 each. And this one is we're talking about is called Superpower, and I think it has like 12 rundowns, and it costs a lot of money to go through Superpower. It's tens of thousands of dollars. And one of the things that you do in Superpower, let me try to explain it. So one of the basic ideas of Scientology is that you go back in time to remember where you were 10,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000 years ago. And L. Ron Hubbard says that if you do it well, you're not just remembering these things on other planets 1,000,000 years ago, you're like reliving it with a whole new set of senses. He called them perceptics. There were 57 of them. And the more you go through Scientology training and are able to go back in time and reconnect with your immortal self, which is a Thetan, the better these senses become, these perceptics. So Miscavige, when he built the flag building, he dedicated the 5th floor of the 7th floor building to, it looks like the deck of the Enterprise from Star Trek. Mm-hmm. And he's got all these different devices that each of them is supposed to test one of your senses. So the gyroscope thing is to test your senses balance up, is what it is. And I actually talked to one of a top former auditor from Scientology that said it was such a joke because, if you know what Superpower auditing and training is, the only time you ever even get into the perceptics is if there's a problem. If everything's going well and you're auditing, you're not going to go use those devices. And anyway, he just made it sound like it was a big waste of time and money. But it definitely looks good. It looks really futuristic. And there's a device to test your hearing, and there's a device to test, textures. And then they get really strange. I mean, there's literally an oiliness table where you can test the sense of oiliness of something. And as one person famously said in a video, a Scientology video, after going through Superpower training, he could sense the saline content of his cells. So
I've seen that.
Yeah,
yes.
So that's what they're referring to, is that they believe they come out of Superpower after spending $50,000 or $60,000. They have these superhuman senses that they can see better than the rest of us. They can hear better than the rest of us. But again, it's just one of those things where they've never demonstrated once any real, gains of this kind of any sort.
I'm not shopping for a cult to enter, but if I was, this is good advertisement. This looks weird and cool and sci-fi-ish.
No, they're pretty good. They're pretty good on some of their marketing materials. They have some real pros when it comes to graphics and design. But then if you just start reading it, you'll start laughing because it's just so ludicrous. But you're right; they do have a pretty good marketing in some of their materials.
Okay, so these are the main things that I wanted to sort of go over in the recent developments. Are there some things that I missed that are important to take a look at?
Well, I think what Leah Remini's doing is just amazing, and I really hand it to her. We're a few episodes into the second season now, and she started out with 3 episodes that were so grim and looking at things like child molestation and suicide, and looking at how Scientology's policies against real mental health care exacerbate these problems, and make it tougher for people to get any kind of help. And they were really depressing, these first 3 episodes, and people you could see the reaction online. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. And then she shifts gears in the 4th episode and talks about the bridge and talks about, OT3, and it was hilarious. I mean, people were laughing. So I really hand it to her that she knows how to keep people interested. Tonight's episode, which I've seen, goes into Miscavige's rise, and they managed to get John Brousseau to do a TV interview, and I believe it's JB's first TV interview, and I did a 2-part series on him with his help several years ago for the Village Voice. Fascinating guy. This is the guy who was L. Ron Hubbard's personal driver, David Miscavige's brother-in-law. He was the guy that fixed up Tom Cruise's motorcycles and other vehicles, and worked on his homes, and refurbished his Burbank airport hangar. And he's also the guy who put the bars on the windows and doors of the hole. So, I mean, on Miscavige's orders. So, I mean, John Brousseau has really had one of the most fascinating and important Scientology careers. And he's on TV for the first time tonight. So, again, I hand it to Leah that she's really, what I like about her show is she respects the viewer. She doesn't dumb things down. She's going into the complexities of Scientology, so she's not afraid to really go into detail. And, she and Mike are such a good team that they pull it off. And then, of course, this past weekend, they won the Emmy. They won the Emmy for Informational Series and beat Tony Bourdain and Neil deGrasse Tyson. So I at the time, I tweeted that this was Hollywood declaring open war on Scientology. And I really believe that. I know there are still people who think that Scientology has this sort of real big presence in Hollywood and they throw their weight around, but that's not the case anymore. I think that Hollywood is really glad to see them shrinking and losing their influence.
And do you think this is going to have a big impact? Like this, from my understanding, this Hollywood thing really was one of the main driving forces for Scientology, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this was a really smart thing that L. Ron Hubbard did. In 1955, he announced Project Celebrity and said that he was going to give a bounty to anybody who brought in a celebrity. And he knew that if he had famous people fronting the organization, it would make it seem more mainstream. And so they've always gone after big names. And they've managed to get a few. And that's another thing I always point out. People say, oh, there's so many Hollywood people in Scientology. No, there's a few, just like there's a few people in the general public. It's always been a very small group. But the names are big. I mean, Tom Cruise and John Travolta and Kirstie Alley and various other stars. But what's interesting is if for many years that was a huge advantage for the Church of Scientology, now it's turning into a liability. Because people like Paul Haggis and Leah Remini and Jason Begay are coming out and speaking out about Church Scientology, And they are paid attention to much more than your typical Scientologist who leaves and speaks up. And also, when you have Leah Remini speaking out, uh, they attack her, but it's not going to shut her up. But I have, it was interesting when she, I broke the news that she left Scientology in 2013, and her book came out in 2015, and then last year her TV series started. And all through that period, Miscavige really didn't go after her very hard. It wasn't until A&E announced that a second season was coming that the gloves came off. And they've just been viciously attacking her at a smear website. And I mean, just it's amazing what they've thrown at her. But, it's the kind of thing that Scientologists probably are impressed by it. But the rest of the world just can't believe that the church is acting like this, because the more they attack her, the more they're showing that what she's saying about the Church of Scientology is true.
So then the dynamic becomes the people on the inside do not get access to the Leah Remini show, right?
Well, that's what my story was about this week. Is take something like Going Clear, for example, Alex Gibney's HBO documentary that I was fortunate enough to be in. Really well made. Larry Wright and Alex Gibney won an Emmy for that. It was the most watched HBO documentary in a decade. And it really galvanized the press and changed a lot, the way, really changed the way Scientology is being talked about. But, Scientologists in the church are very good at ignoring that kind of thing. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to talk about it, because they know if you sneak a peek at Going Clear late at night on your cable system at home, you might be turned in by somebody in your own family who tells because Scientology is a snitching culture. It's an interrogation culture. And you get hauled in. I talked to a woman, they found out she had watched Leah Remini on Dancing with the Stars. And she was subjected to a 3-week interrogation that cost her more than $4,000. And then they kicked her out of the church. So this is why Scientologists are very good at policing themselves. What's different now from Going Clear is that David Miscavige is so desperate to fight Leah Remini, he's now asked church members to send letters to A&E's advertisers and to sign an online petition. Well, once you do that, you're basically giving Scientologists at least some level of permission to find out what it is they're protesting.
Right.
So I think, Miscavige is really playing with fire on this, because he's basically saying, I need you to write letters, attacking this show. I need you to go online and sign a petition and explain why you think this show shouldn't be on the air. And the Scientologists are going to ask themselves, well, what's in the show that's so bad? And so I really think Miscavige is taking a big risk. It reminds me of something that happened 8 years ago. When Marty Rathbun and Mike Rinder had first come out and were speaking to the Tampa Bay Times, Miscavige had their magazine attack the Tampa Bay Times in a really cartoonish attack dog way. And Scientologists were given copies of the magazine, and they knew that it was ludicrous what the magazine was saying, and it motivated them to go find out more online about the real story. I've talked to a lot of ex-Scientologists who tell me that their disaffection began when they were given that magazine and realized that it had to be lies. So I think there's the potential for that to happen now. Miscavige has asked his people, I need you to help me in this fight. And all it's going to do is make them curious about what Leah's saying. And that could backfire really badly on Miscavige.
Mm-hmm. So you think it actually might have, on the one hand, you have a diminished interest on the part, diminished likelihood of somebody new joining the church because there's all this bad press, and then you think this one actually might sort of break the wall and also persuade some people to leave the church.
It's been happening. I mean, it's been happening. It's been shrinking. People have been coming out, and it's getting smaller and smaller. But I think what Leah wants to happen is she really wants a federal investigation. She wants the FBI to get interested. She wants the IRS to get interested. I don't know if they're going to. It's, Scientology has done such a good job over the last 50 years, really just conquering the U.S. courts, U.S. law enforcement agencies. Everyone is really gun shy about fighting with them. So I understand why Leah wants that, and it'll be interesting if she can make it happen. But I think it's important just to get more and more people aware of what's going on, because as you say, it makes it a lot tougher to recruit new people. But you know what? There are always a few new people who are curious and get into it. I just heard yesterday from somebody that's very early, into their Scientology courses, and was complaining to me about, why don't you talk about, the good stuff? And I said, well, how deep into it are you? I mean, let's talk about the grades. Let's talk about the Joburg sex check. And they didn't know what I was talking about. So they're in too soon to really understand what they're getting into. And it was just interesting to hear that there are still young people who are curious enough about it to try it out.
And then there's also, Scientology is a global thing. There are countries where, I guess, my country is a country where Going Clear wasn't in the theaters, and Lee Remini's show is not on TV. So that part, it's not that it's censored or anything. It's just not coming in. So it's a different environment.
They've had more luck in Taiwan, and in Russia. But Russia's really cracked down hard on them, and in a way that I'm not sure is entirely helpful. But in Taiwan, I don't know that there's any critical press whatsoever. And it's what really matters is what's happening in the United States. I mean, the Flag Land Base in Clearwater, Florida, brings in more income on a weekly basis than all of the other facilities around the globe combined. So, and how are they staffing that place? We just got some new information about that. It's, people they're bringing over from Russia, people they're bringing over from Italy, people they're bringing from Hungary on religious visas, because Americans are just not interested in, working 112 hours a week for $25 a week and 16-hour days.
So they're getting they get the staff from all these other places, but they get the money from Americans. It's just because Americans are more wealthy?
They come from all over the world at Flag. If you're in Italy and you've reached OT6 and you want to do OT6 and OT7, there's only one place in the world you can do that. That's the Flag Land Base in Clearwater. So that's why eventually everybody ends up going there. And these courses are incredibly expensive. These courses cost tens of thousands, but it's more than that. It's what you're going to spend in accommodations, being there for 3 or 4 weeks, and all the meals you have to buy, and what you have to do to keep your business at home still thrive. I mean, Jason Begay explained all this to me, that you go there to do a $10,000 course, you come home $50,000 or $60,000 later. It's an incredible commitment.
All right. So listen, you mentioned the IRS, and this is one of the things that in the previous conversation, I felt like we've covered most of the kind of essentials, basics, Scientology 101. This is one thing that we didn't talk about, and it's one of the major kind of parts of the story of Scientology, how it won the war this is the Scientology war, the war is over was the big tagline when they got the tax-exempt status. And I want to ask you about that particular story, but also, part of the reason I think studying groups like Scientology is worthwhile is they don't exist in a vacuum, right? And so we can see what your attitude towards the IRS or the FBI or the American system generally might change when you look at how it treats this group or that group. And with there was one thing that I saw on your website when I think it was still election time in America, and you said that people keep bringing up the similarities between Trump and Hubbard, or Trump and Miscavige, and you said, well, yeah, Trump is like L. Ron Hubbard, but that doesn't mean there's an actual connection between them as entities. While there is a clear connection between, I guess, Bill Clinton, but maybe the Clintons as a unit as well. So can you talk about that? What is that connection between Bill Clinton and Scientology, and then the whole story of getting the tax
what I was
exempt
pointing
status?
out was I honestly don't know what Hillary Clinton thinks about Scientology, but there's no question Scientology never had a better friend in the White House than Bill Clinton. The tax exempt status thing was actually started under his predecessor, George H.W. Bush, the first Bush president, and I think they each equally share credit for that. But it was Clinton that signed it in October '93, and he went to bat for them in other ways as well. I mean, it was Bill Clinton that got the State Department to start fighting for Scientology overseas, particularly in Germany. And there's no question that Bill Clinton was, really loved the fact that John Travolta played him in the movie Primary Colors. So there was a lot of history there that suggested that if Hillary feels the way her husband does, that Scientology might find another friend in the White House. I don't know. We will never know. She's not going to be president. On the other hand, with Trump, I saw people immediately making this connection that he's just like Hubbard. He talks like Miscavige. The way he treats people is like Scientology. That Trump followers are a lot like Scientologists. And I understood why people were saying that, but that's all style. I mean, there was no real connection I saw between Trump and Scientology. But from Inauguration Day on, I was seeing attempts by Scientology to get in with him. They sent one of their top billionaires. She was at their inauguration, and since then they've made other inroads. I mean, there's this young woman named Joy Villa, who is a Scientologist who wore the Trump dress to the Grammys and instantly became embraced by Trump followers. Apparently not real. Her dress had the name Trump on it, and it became this huge. There are not very many people. She claimed to be a recording artist. There are not many people in the arts who have anything to do with Trump, and so she was immediately embraced by Trump followers. And she had been a Bernie supporter who just wore the dress as she's a climber. She's trying to make a name for herself, and she's married to a wealthy Scientologist. They've donated a lot of money to Scientology. And now she's become this, celebrated Trump follower to the point where Trump recently actually put her on one of his advisory boards. So that's kind of troubling. And then the other thing we noticed was that with these hurricanes hitting the U.S., we noticed that Trump's FEMA emergency management group has put out a list of people you can donate money to help hurricane victims, and one of them listed was the Church of Scientology. So
that is interesting. How does that help?
It's just one of the ways Scientology is always trying to improve its image by, they go to these disaster sites and hand out water and stuff. But they also do faith healing. I mean, they do this bizarre thing where they put their hands just over your body and then ask you to feel their finger. It's really strange. So, I think there's this small attempt by Scientology to kind of worm their way in with Trump. But I still don't know. I really don't know if Trump knows anything about Scientology. I mean, one thing I'll point out to people that wonder if he's a secret Scientologist is, whatever you think of Scientology's ideas, in order to be a Scientologist, you at least need to have some patience, and you need to be able to read. And Trump has neither, right? I mean, he doesn't read, and he has no patience. So he'd be a terrible Scientologist. It never worked. So anyway, that's why I feel like there's no real connection. But how Scientology is probably benefiting from the Trump administration is that Trump has gone after the Johnson Amendment. When you get tax exempt status under the IRS, you're allowed to keep all your money and not pay any to the government. But one of the things you have to agree to is you can't engage in partisan politics. So a Baptist church, for example, is not supposed to endorse a candidate and try to convince its followers to vote for that candidate. If they do so, they risk losing their tax-exempt status. Now, I would argue the IRS has always been pretty lax as far as enforcing that. But Trump has now come out and said he wants to get rid of that rule entirely. He wants churches to be able to endorse candidates. And he has said that he doesn't want the IRS to investigate churches. Well, I can tell you that's music to the ears of Scientologists. But they just, the number one, see, Scientology, Scientology knows it has a terrible reputation, and politicians generally don't want to have anything to do with it. But what they really want is to be left alone. And here is the President of the United States saying, I don't want my agencies investigating churches. They must be celebrating over that. So, and I know most Scientologists tend to be on the right side of the aisle, and a lot of them seem to support Trump. So they're probably pretty happy right now.
Okay. So back though to the origins of Scientology as a religion, I still haven't, I'm not from America, so it's kind of difficult for me still to figure out how religion works in America. And looking at this, when Scientology was granted tax-exempt status, there's one way that I can look at it that it kind of makes sense. It seems that anything is a religion, and there are so many different churches, and they get quite a lot of freedom in what they can do because of their status as a religion. But on the other hand, as I'm watching, or reading about Scientology in particular, there was this whole war between IRS and Scientology, and it ended up with, like, they basically, as far as I understand, Scientology won that war by having more lawyers and being more ruthless in courts.
Scientology lost its tax-exempt status in 1967 precisely because the courts decided it was a business benefiting one man, Hubbard. I mean, you can be a church, you can call yourself a church, you can say you're a religion, and the rules are pretty lax, and pretty much anything that calls itself a church can be a church. But then to get tax-exempt status, you need to jump through a few more hoops, and you need to be careful about things. But it can't just be a money-making business to enrich one person. That's against the rules. And so from 1967 on, the government did not consider it a tax-exempt group. And that's what they were fighting against up until the early 90s. Was, the courts were always on the IRS's side. The IRS was under no obligation to reopen this question and grant the church tax-exempt status. Why it did was that, people that have left Scientology are quite open about this, and Mark Rathbun was at one time, that they just spent years, at war with the IRS, and that meant, a couple of thousand lawsuits filed against individual IRS agents, officials, harassing those officials, bugging their conference rooms and surveilling them. It was a all-out harassment campaign, and eventually it was enough to cause the IRS to finally say, enough, we've had enough. What happened was in October 91, David Miscavige and Marty Rathbun were in Washington, D.C., and this was the biggest thing that consumed them. As Marty said in Going Clear, they had lost the tax status in 1967, but they'd never paid after that. Right? It just was just a tax bill that built up and up and up and up. So by the late 80s, early 90s, they owed more than $1 billion to the U.S. government. And, Marty has said, we owed them $1 billion and we didn't have it. I think he said in Going Clear that they had about a quarter of that or something. And eventually this was going to destroy the Church of Scientology if they didn't do something about it. And so they were really this was their number one concern in 1991 when David Miscavige and Marty Rathbun decided to walk into the offices of the IRS commissioner one day in October 91. And they went to the desk and said, we want to see the commissioner. And, you can't just walk into the IRS offices and ask to see the commissioner. It doesn't work that way. And they were told, no, listen, you know how it works. You have to, make an appointment. And they're like, no, that takes months.
we want to see him now. Well, apparently they were so persuasive that the commissioner agreed to see them in like a week. So that was a huge victory, right? And so a week later, they got together with the commissioner, and they had this meeting. And Marty's described it to me. And he said at one point, they made it obvious, if we can find a way to work this problem out, all the harassment goes away, all the lawsuits go away, right? And at the end of the meeting, Fred Goldberg, the IRS commissioner under George Herbert Walker Bush, walked over to Marty and said, "Is what he's saying accurate? Will this really happen? All the harassment will end?" And Marty said, "Yeah, that's exactly what'll happen." And Marty says that his commissioner's shoulders sort of like slumped, like, okay. And that was it. I mean, the commissioner then ordered a study be done, and empaneled various officials to make it happen. And I've been told, now it took 2 more years, right? And they really made Scientology run the gamut. I mean, they had them turn in all these documents, and they had to work very hard for it. But I've been told by tax experts that I consulted years ago when I first worked on this story, who told me that once Fred Goldberg made that decision, it was a done deal, and it took 2 more years, and then and by that time the president had changed, and then it was Clinton who actually signed it. But in October 1993, 2 years later, they got everything they were asking for. I mean, just tax-exempt status for virtually every entity, and instead of having to pay $1 billion, they paid, I'm going to forget the exact amount. Was it 9 million or was it 90? I'm forgetting what it was. But it was pennies on the dollar, okay? And it was 9 million. I think it was 9 million instead of $1 billion. So that's why, you can see why David Miscavige would then have this giant event to say, we're now fully tax exempt, the war is over. I mean, those are Miscavige's own words. I know now Marty Rathbun, in his new, valence, as they would say in Scientology, is claiming that, oh no, we were always entitled to this. It was just a matter of filing some forms, and the court was always on our side, and we didn't do anything dishonest, and we didn't harass IRS. I mean, he's singing this completely different tune now. But Miscavige himself says it right there. The war is over. They were at war with the IRS for years, and they won.
But so do you think, this is like a general question, but do you think Scientology is different from other kinds of churches? Like, I've spent some time in America, and that was in Houston, and they have a Joel Osteen's church there, which is a stadium where they when you said that the church cannot be a business for one person, I haven't looked very deeply into the Lakewood Church, but it seems like a business of one person.
There's no question that other churches in the United States take in donations, and that there are some very wealthy pastors in this country. There's no question about that. But I think what separates Scientology and what the courts had a problem with is that in Scientology, there's literally a price list.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
If you go into Joel Osteen's church, okay, they're not going to have a price list saying, okay, if you give us 10,000, you're going to be on this cloud in heaven.
Right.
And if you give us 50,000, you'll be on this cloud in heaven. It doesn't. I say that, I'm sure they have different levels of donations, and I'm not saying that these guys don't do something similar. But in Scientology, it's literally a price list on how you go from this to that to this to that, and that's what bothered the courts, and that the prices are ludicrous. I mean, they're paying $800 to $900 an hour for counseling at the upper end of the bridge, and you can spend years on that. I mean, Mark Headley has estimated that to go from very beginning to OT8 is going to cost you anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million.
That's all I mean.
And it's just that's what has always bothered the courts. But the IRS decided that they're going to give it tax-exempt status, and the effect that has is it's not just a matter of them paying taxes. Okay,
why the tax-exempt status is so important is that it discourages law enforcement from looking into things. Because if Scientology is sued or Scientology is prosecuted, the first thing the attorneys do is they go to the judge and say, Judge, it's a church. You can't look into our internal affairs. And that works. That works most of the time in our courts. So, there's a lawsuit going on right now in Los Angeles about a woman who joined the Sea Org at 12 years old. And at 12 years old, she was working 90 hours a week for little or no pay. She got in trouble because she admitted that she missed her mother. Okay. And Scientology recently, not too long ago, put in a court filing. It was really surprising to me that they're getting they're sort of like dropping all pretenses. And they said, look, we consider her a minister, right? This is a religious commitment, and there's nothing the state can do about it. I mean, they were really blatant about it this time. They usually dance around it. In that court case, they were really blatant. The way they feel is, even if you're a young child and you sign our billion-year contract, we can do whatever we want to you. It's just amazing to me that law enforcement agencies and courts are too afraid. They just think, we don't want to waste the money to pull them into court and then they have the judge say, yeah, First Amendment rights, tax-exempt status, you're right, we can't do anything about it. But that has happened.
Okay. This question of Trump being like Hubbard made me think of not even particularly Trump. To me, it does seem that the current general kind of climate, from what I can tell from media, because I haven't been in America for some time, but I have American friends and I watch the news, and it seems that things have changed since the election in such a way that Scientology kind of is not as ridiculous as it used to be. It doesn't seem like, it used to be this kind of like staple or go to thing, the OT3, the Xeno stories, the aliens and whatnot.
Well, when we have Nazis with tiki torches marching in the streets, and our president is a birther who provides safe haven to 9/11 truthers. Scientology is looking a lot less bizarre than it did before. I understand what you mean.
I watched a few shows by Alex Jones, who is, as far as I can tell, like one of the few media outlets that is not fake news according to the sitting president of the country, right? And what he's saying is, as far out as the Scientology stuff, there are aliens involved, there are multidimensional planes of existence, there's energetic vampires who are all a part of a globalist conspiracy and so forth. And even apart from that, this is clearly a part of the political developments of the recent months or a year or whatever. But even outside of that, and not limited to America either, there's this, that if you Google flat Earth theory, you'll see a whole bunch of videos, some of them well made, with people really arguing that Earth really is flat, and there is a little bit of a following for that. So, I'm not entirely sure what my question here is. Do you think that
were Scientologists just ahead of their time? Is that the lesson we're learning now? Well, let me tell you about. There was recently a magazine story by Kurt Anderson, who's an interesting figure. Who started Spy Magazine back in the 90s, and just really a very smart, intelligent journalist. He recently wrote a fascinating essay. I liked it. I know some other people didn't like it. He basically took on what you're talking about. This what's happened to America? How has America lost its mind? Why are our politics no longer, about how to deliver services to the public, but now are just these bizarre conspiracy theories and all this craziness? And he's talked about how some really interesting sort of history of how this all kind of comes out of the 60s and the distrust of authority figures. Really interesting essay. And it was kind of a big deal the week that it came out. It was like probably the most read thing in the country. And what I noted was he mentioned Scientology 3 times as sort of the harbinger of why everything in America was going to pot, you know? And so that was great. It's like, yeah, Scientology was kind of the leading edge of how you can have intelligent people who really seem to care about things they call technology and science, and it takes them into these bizarre beliefs without any evidence. And that's kind of where the rest of the public has gone. And you're right. And but even so, you look at, you know, how well Leah Remini's doing, and even with all the other craziness going on around the world, people are still very fascinated by Scientology and what's happening to it. No question.
So I want to go again back into the history with kind of a stated goal of trying to figure out that dynamic of how a reality is formed. Like I said, that I think it's worthwhile to study Scientology because it can shed light on how other institutions work. Like Scientology is a little like a cult, a little like a corporation, a little like a political party, a little like all of these different things. So you can look at different facets, and it can inform your understanding of how other groups function. It also, and that's kind of that's a way that it's relevant in the previous reality, you know, the Clinton era, let's say. It's rational. You understand it's just economics and politics, basically, and power. But now in this age that we're living in, the more interesting part becomes, to me, this dynamic of how people end up living in different realities. Like you think you're doing journalism, and I think there are people in the Church of Scientology who think you're an unwilling agent of the invader forces from Mars, right? And there's a similar thing happening in the society broadly, where somebody thinks he's just, you know, has views on what rights people should have in a democratic country, and then somebody else thinks, well, he is in bed with the globalists that sacrifice animals at Bohemian Grove or something. So in order to try and figure out that part of how people end up in living in different realities that intersect on the different angles, I want to go back to the roots of Scientology. The previous conversation started with Dianetics. Well, there's a period before Dianetics that I don't know much about where Hubbard had connections or hung out with Parsons and Crowley. And can you tell me more? Well, first, who's Jack Parsons, who's Aleister Crowley, and what the connection is between Hubbard and them, and who Hubbard was at the time?
Well, Hubbard had been he was a pulp fiction writer. He wrote a lot of westerns, adventure stories. He eventually started to do science fiction, which was not his favorite, but for some reason he's most well known for now. He really did well in the late 30s, early 40s, particularly because there was an editor named Campbell at Astounding Magazine, Unknown Magazine. And he really had a following. He had a big following. And then World War II happened, and he was, you know, this for a guy like Hubbard, this was like the big chance to do something big in the world. And he had this terrible World War II experience where, you know, he would be given command of a ship. He was in the Navy, he was a lieutenant in the Navy. He'd be given command of a ship and then was relieved of command. For whatever reason, and at one point he engaged in a battle off the coast of Oregon for 32 hours, which was what he believed were 2 Japanese submarines, but the Navy later decided he was depth charging a mineral deposit, a magnetic deposit on the seafloor. And then he sailed down the coast and used a Mexican island for target practice, which caused an international incident, and that's how he lost that command. So by the time the war ended in 1945, he had hemorrhoids, he had arthritis, he had pink eye, and he was in a hospital mainly because he was depressed about the whole thing.
He's still a young man at that point, right?
At 45, he would have been 34 years old, but he told everybody these tall tales that he was the first American casualty in the Pacific Theater, that he'd been machine gunned Borneo or something, or Papua New Guinea, and then, or I guess in Java, or I don't know, somewhere over there. He was machine gunned and then floated in a raft all the way to Australia. I mean, he came up with these amazing stories, none of which are anywhere near the truth. He was never actually fired upon in combat or anything like that. So he comes out of that, and he runs into a friend of his who introduces him to Parsons. Now, Jack Parsons is this fascinating figure in Pasadena who was literally a rocket scientist. He was one of the early scientists, rocket scientists at Caltech, and helped found the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL. And he also, besides being a rocketeer and a real expert on fuels, he also happened to be an occultist and was a big fan of Aleister Crowley. And the way you remember how to say that name right is it's like holy.
Okay.
Aleister Crowley is not a holy man. So Crowley was this fascinating guy who called himself the Beast, and he was this occultist and had a big following in England. And there were various groups around the United States that followed him and read his writings and stuff. And Parsons was part of one of those groups in Los Angeles and got Hubbard into it. Hubbard never actually met Crowley, but Parsons corresponded with Crowley pretty regularly. And in late 45, early 46, they got up to some pretty strange sex magic rituals, and Parsons described them in his writings. And first Hubbard stole away his girlfriend, Sarah Northrup, and Hubbard was still married to his first wife at the time. And Parsons then found this woman named Marjorie Cameron, who he believed that if they performed the rituals correctly, he was going to impregnate with the Antichrist. And so they did these rituals where, as Lawrence Wright describes them, Jack Parsons was trying to impregnate Marjorie Cameron while L. Ron Hubbard was taking notes, except he wasn't using a pen, if you know what I mean. And so they had these bizarre things going on, which you got to understand. I think that's great. I think it's great that L. Ron Hubbard, when he was 35 years old, was, dressed up in robes and ringing bells and doing enchantments to try to create, this opening of the dimensions or whatever. Good for him. I think that's wonderful. And he was clearly into it. He read widely. He was really into the occult. So that ended pretty quickly. He and Sarah, the girlfriend he had taken away from Parsons, ended up ripping Parsons off in this bizarre business deal they tried to do. And then he ended up marrying Sarah, even though he was still married to his first wife. He committed bigamy. It's pretty famous. So then a few years later, he started working on this new... He had actually first started writing about the human mind in this manuscript in 38 called Excalibur. Now in 48 and 49, he was really starting to work on it. He was writing letters to Robert Heinlein and telling him he'd come up with this whole new thing, and it's going to replace... He literally said in a letter to Robert Heinlein, this is going to replace the Catholic Church. Okay? So, and at that same time, people that went to some of his gatherings, this is the period when he supposedly said, writing for a penny a word in the pulps for science fiction is no way to make a living. If you want to get rich, you should start a religion. He supposedly said that to a couple of gatherings in 48 or 49, but I feel much better evidence is this letter he wrote to Heinlein saying that Dianetics is going to replace Catholicism. I mean, he's pretty open about, he thought this thing was obviously going to have this big impact. So that's what all led up to his publication in 1950. And probably the only reason any of us is talking about Dianetics 62 years later, 67 years later, is that he got his editor into it. Okay, Campbell fell for it completely, felt that this was going to change the world, and he really promoted it, and he published a smaller version of Dianetics in the May 1950 edition of Astounding. Now, what the heck, in a science fiction magazine, what the heck is a giant, discussion of the human mind doing in there? It was totally inappropriate, but Campbell was so into what Hubbard was saying, he gave him this prime placement that came out just a couple of weeks before the book itself did. It was a huge launching pad for Hubbard. It helps explain why he had this, was super popular for a few months, and why, what Dianetics, what he was promising at that time was, if you could remember what happened to you in the womb, when you were still inside your mother as a fetus, you could remember traumas that you went through because mom and dad were having rough sex, or dad said something rude to mom, whatever. You absorbed that as a fetus, and 40 years later, you were having back problems or rashes, or you couldn't hold on to a job, or you couldn't speak in public, all because of these things that were put into you by your parents when you were a fetus.
Is that his idea, or did he borrow this from somewhere?
Some ideas like that had been around, and just the basic idea of trying to remember your earlier traumas and talk them out to somebody, that's psychoanalysis, right? And a lot of people have remarked on the fact that this was basically a poor man's psychoanalysis. That's been around for, I've heard that phrase for 20 years. But the difference was, and Freud says it, when you are asking someone to remember a trauma as a child, it doesn't matter if it really happened or not. The point is that they speak it out and have that release, right? Hubbard takes it farther and says, you're going to remember things that didn't just happen in your childhood. You're going to remember things that happened when you were a sperm or an egg or a zygote or a fetus, and they are real. And this is not guessing, right? And people love that idea, and they love the idea that they can somehow remember what happened to them when they were in the womb, right? Which I would submit is absolute nonsense and completely ludicrous. But people felt, they really dug it. And then a year later, in 1951, he announced that he had this machine that could help verify that those memories were real. And that's what the E-meter was. Now, the E-meter is just 1/4 of a polygraph. A polygraph, a lie detector machine, measures your respiration, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and what's called skin galvanism, the electrical current going through your skin. A polygraph examiner, looking at all 4 of those inputs, can see that when you answer a particular question, that you are feeling more stress, and that might indicate that you're being deceptive. But the courts have always been reluctant to use polygraph examinations because it's indirect. The machine is not literally saying he's lying. It's just saying that, oh, when he answered that question, his blood pressure went up, his breathing quickened, and his skin galvanism increased, whatever. And the polygraph expert then says, you know what, that all suggests to me that he's being deceptive. The E-meter is only one of those 4 things. Just the skin galvanism, just measuring the current of electricity in your skin. And yet they ascribe all kinds of, oh, it's reading the mind, it can tell when they put way too much emphasis on it. And the other thing I always ask people is, if it's measuring your skin current, why are you holding it? The contacts are called cans, and you're holding it. Well, the skin galvanism signal is already, weak enough. You hold it in the grip changes, the signal's completely corrupted. All right, and Scientologists can never give me a good answer for that, because the E-meter works off the ideomotor effect, the same principle behind dowsing and the Ouija board. You swear you're holding those cans as steady as you can, but you can't. There's always going to be variation in your grip, and that's going to affect the signal coming from your skin galvanism. Anyway, that's my spiel about why the E-meter is problematic. But he introduced that and said the combination of a Scientologist holding those cans and then the auditor watching the needle can tell you those memories are real. So now you've got somebody, people in general, not just Americans, love to be told that something that they're thinking about is verified.
Right.
And so,
I mean, this is a powerful idea. This little device really, it doesn't even matter what it shows. If you have a device to kind of defer the authority to, that's more powerful than some guy telling you.
Well, that's why I say
what's
that
right
even
or
though it's
what's
only
wrong.
1/4 of a lie detector machine, it ends up being a fantastic lie detector machine because the people believe it. If you believe that you cannot hold a secret to this machine, you'll spill your guts, and that's what Scientologists do. Um, and then what happened was he gathered a lot of followers early on in 1950, and then a lot of people kind of got disaffected and left, and he had a terrible 1951. But some of the followers that stuck with him were like, listen, going back to my time in the womb is great, but I want to go back farther. And that's when this idea of past lives came up. So when he basically, Hubbard lost everything in bankruptcy in 51 and had to regroup in 1952 in Wichita and then in Phoenix. He lost the use of the word Dianetics temporarily in court. So he had to come up with
That's why he had to come up with Scientology.
And that's where Scientology comes from, is he was regrouping and he was getting into past life therapy. And that's why it's interesting if you look deeply into it. Dianetics and the idea of remembering what you went through in the womb and Scientology, remembering what you did millions of years ago, really aren't compatible. And there's a very funny fixes that he put in to make it work, which I think are hilarious.
What do you mean, the little fixes?
Well, okay, so for example, in Scientology, okay, well, first, in Dianetics, the most important memories that are called engrams, that are part of your reactive mind, that are holding you back, occurred when you were in the womb, when you were a sperm, an egg, a zygote, a fetus. Prenatal memories are the most important things that are holding you back in your adult life. Now, in Scientology, the idea is you've lived countless times, you're remembering what you were doing on planets millions of years ago, and when you come to the end of a particular life and the body dies, you, the Thetan, the spirit inside, go down to the local maternity ward, jump into a baby, and start a new life. You see the problem there? If your most important memories are prenatal when you were a fetus, how do you get those if you jump into a baby that's just been born? You see? There's a problem there, and so
so the Thetan jumps into a baby that's been born already.
yes, you go to the maternity ward, you find a baby, and you jump in there before another Thetan does. And so if that's the case, how do you have those prenatal memories? And so Hubbard had to come up with a fix, a very awkward fix he calls the genetic entity, which is a sort of half Thetan that's part of the fetus, but it's part of the body. And anyway, it's just see what I'm saying? To the outsider, it's just very obvious what's going on, is that he's changed the ideas and he's trying to make them work together, and they don't really work.
Well, okay, so I still want to go back a little further into this pre-Dianetics period, because I'm wondering, I saw on your website some excerpts from a recording, maybe it's even before the Crowley thing, when Hubbard tried to sort of self-hypnotize and work on his self-esteem and whatnot, sexual problems or something.
Right.
Told himself that he's going to be a great writer and so forth. So it seems that the beginning, the roots of Scientology there are various dimensions to it. There's a desire to build a structure that's going to bring in money and going to be powerful and popular in the world. There's also interest in the occult and the Crowley methods. But then it starts with trying to help himself, right? This is self-help investigations kind of on his part. Is that right?
Yeah, well, one thing to keep in mind is that Hubbard was a very good hypnotist, and we have accounts from his friends at the time that say in the 40s he was very good stage hypnotist and did those shows where he could make people think they had a tiny kangaroo down jumping on the palm and things like that. And what you're referring to are things that he wrote up for self-hypnosis, I believe in 1947, somewhere in that period, so just after the period with Parsons and Crowley. And he wrote a series of statements that he was going to record and then play back to himself, I think is how it worked. Maybe he read them, I'm not sure. But they were motivational statements to try to help him deal with the fact that he was depressed. There were a lot of things, bad things in his life. And so you can see him talking about, he had various physical ailments. He had various sexual problems. He had real confidence problems with women. And he goes through them and just to try to, build up his own confidence. And they end up just being very revealing to us about all the things in his life that were going on at that time. And some of the things he talks about in there are how what he's really after is power over other people. He really thought of himself as this special human being. He had written a letter to his first wife years earlier where he said that his goal was to smash his name into history. And he talks in the affirmations of those things you're talking about, where he's talking about, ruling over other people. He didn't have a lot of respect for other people. He really felt that he should enslave them. He talks about enslaving people. And this was his, if you're gonna be sort of a leader among people and you're gonna consider yourself almost superhuman, it's kind of like not a great sign that you've got a bad hip and you've got stomach problems and you have a hard time in bed. And so I think he was trying to convince himself that these were minor and that he was still the man he wanted to be, to build up his confidence. And then that kind of, I think that goes into, you're right, I think that goes into Scientology, and that Scientology can be looked at as sort of a self-help. If he was engaging in self-hypnosis in 1947, and this is very controversial, but people, academics who study Scientology say that the auditing uses forms of hypnosis. That I don't know if you saw this the other night on the last episode of the Remedy Show, but they actually did a little auditing on camera between Bruce Hines.
Right, examples of how it would work.
And what was it that you should have taken from that is how repetitive it is. That Bruce Hines kept asking the same question, and Leah had to decide, am I going to say the same thing? Am I going to say something different? You can be asked the same question hundreds of times in a row. And experts will tell you that's how you put somebody into a hypnotic state, right? In a very...
Well, so this is interesting to me. I'm trying to try and tie it in with this issue of ending up in a different reality than when you started. Scientology, it seems like, unlike many religions, it really has like a method. It has a practice that you, whether you believe or not, like if you're told the story about the invader forces and whatnot, rationally you might not be interested in it, or you might doubt it. But then you actually do auditing and you talk about this and you go. For me, it's like I try to, as when I saw these examples of how auditing works with this repetition and so forth, I try to just sit and think, what would that do to me? And I really couldn't. I asked myself a question maybe 5 times in a row. I ran out of answers and I gave up the exercise. But if you're in a room with a person who's insisting that you have to do that, what does it do to you? What is the effect of that? Do you have like an understanding of...
I mean, I remember talking to one tech expert who revealed to me that one of the most expensive auditing rundowns consists of a single question.
Right, you told me
for days and days and days. And
where do you feel safe?
And I thought, you're paying $10,000 for that? And he responded, Tony, you'll be amazed at what you come up with when you're asked that for the 300th time.
Do you know what people come up with?
What happens is they end up going down these chains of memories and going down, millions of years ago and billions of years ago and remembering all these. I mean, I remember one time I had a guy I really respect, a guy I really like, but he was telling me that what he would find again and again as he was answering these questions and being asked to remember things that had happened to him is he kept finding out that on whatever planet he was on, he ended up being a leader and always got his head cut off. And to this day, he has a neck ache. Now, I look at that and I think, I can't believe you're paying tens of thousands of dollars for this nonsense. But to him, it was really meaningful. So, I think that the experts have a point when they say that there's a hypnotic element to Scientology because of its repetitive nature And as you said, it's a controlled environment. You're in this auditing room. You can't go anywhere. And Nancy Meny has talked about how this kind of questioning just really can mess with your head, your mental health. But I tend to report more on what they're doing and less on the theory about whether it's hypnosis or not, because I know with a lot of Scientologists that's very controversial.
Well, I mean, you can call it whatever. I mean, it's still like it's a thing that you do that then has an effect
Right.
on you, and that to me is like I'm really curious, and what kinds of, like, there are different techniques that people use to change their own life. They change their own understanding of what's going on with them, of their identity and so forth. I've been running into people. Part of the reason I asked you whether Hubbard came up with prenatal stuff or did he borrow it from somewhere else. I heard stories, just people that I met that went to has nothing to do with Scientology or any religion or any church. There's like a personal development training for middle-aged managers or whatever. And one guy told me a story. There's like a thing that they do, I don't know what to call that exactly, exercise, where people get naked, a whole bunch of people lay down in a row, and then the person doing the exercise needs to crawl underneath these bodies, which then makes him kind of relieve the birthing experience and find out what that birth trauma was. And it's a very similar thing to Scientology. You find out that you suffered from this and that when you were being born, and that pattern is is being repeated in your life and so forth. So there are, the thing that I'm interested in is when this whole thing was started, when Hubbard was trying to self-improve and doing these exercises, was that did his reality change at that time into did he find a birth trauma of his own, prenatal trauma of his own, that then made him this bigger successful church founder person?
Well, Hubbard talks about an experience he had, I believe, in 1938, where he had some kind of a tooth problem, and he went to the dentist, and they put him under with nitrous oxide, and he thinks that he died for a few minutes in the dentist chair or something. I don't know what it was, but he told friends afterwards that he had this vision where he was approaching a gate, and on the other side of it was all the world's wisdom. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he saw it. And he had this vision of what all the world's wisdom amounted to. And he ended up deciding that it was a single word: survive. And, this is the basis of part of Dianetics, that this major revelation that as biological creatures, our number one motivation is to survive, which doesn't seem like the most earth-shattering vision to me, but whatever. But that's he always talked about that he believed that he had been imparted this major wisdom, and it had made him maybe a superior being to others, and that part of Scientology was you're creating a new human race that's evolved. I think that's a lot of what's behind the New Age movement. Is, I'm a half Mexican kid from Southern California, working class parents. I did pretty well in school. I basically know what my options are in the world and where I fit in the world. As a human being, you're walking around in this body that's got various limitations, and you I don't know. It seems like it's pretty evident what the possibilities of life are and where you're going to go in life. But forever, you can go back thousands of years and see the same thing in like the Gnostic movement, for example. There's always been this other set of beliefs where people say, this can't be it, right? I can't be this mundane human being with no more, there's got to be something more than this. And they search for this idea that this vessel is really hiding this super amazing galactic secret, that you're part of some giant narrative and you're really this, in Scientology, you're a fallen god, right? You're the original Thetans created the universe because they were bored and playing a game and then they got trapped in it. And that's who you are today. And if you can just go through Scientology processing, you can regain your godlike powers, operating Thetan level powers, which I was just listening to a lecture by Hubbard the other day, and he was saying, once you become OT, you'll be able to crush a planet between your finger and your thumb. Okay? That's what they're trying to get to in Scientology. It's not just this mundane human being from the worst part of Los Angeles who, tries to write for a living. There's this much bigger thing. And so I think some of these movements, they look for ways to disrupt our normal social structure and our normal ways of thinking, whether it's getting naked in a room and nobody gets to go to the bathroom for a whole weekend, or whether it's walking on coals, or whether in Scientology it's sitting down with this machine. Whatever it is, it's just to disrupt our normal way of thinking and think there's something really amazing, this universe inside you that you need to find. And I think it's fueled a lot of the New Age movement, not just Scientology.
Is there kind of a random question, but is there a narrative in Scientology that explains like the events outside, like, I don't know, an apocalyptic vision of the world? The hurricanes hit in America. Is that explained?
What's interesting about Scientology is it does not have an apocalyptic vision. Unlike so many of these other churches and religions that are all looking for signs of the end of the world, Scientology instead has this idea that you've lived countless times in the past, you're going to live countless times in the future. What's important is that spirit that you are, called a Thetan. The body, the particular body you're in right now doesn't matter. The environment doesn't matter. The landscape doesn't matter. That's all what's called messed universe, matter, energy, space, and time. And it just doesn't matter that much. So they're not looking for volcanoes to erupt and earthquakes to shatter the world and the asteroids to hit the earth, because to them that's all matter. Doesn't it's just not important. What matters is the spirit, is the Thetan. And you're going to be here so many millions and billions of years. Anything the earth is facing right now just doesn't matter to them. So they're not looking for the end of the world, which is strange that Hubbard originally, when he wrote OT8, which they didn't make public until after he died, he announced, surprise, I'm the Antichrist. So it's really weird that he had pushed this idea that had no connection to Christianity whatsoever, no connection to the other world's religions, really didn't care anything about, cataclysms or the world. And then suddenly, near the end of his life, put out this surprising communication that he's the Antichrist and he's part of this whole Christian narrative. Bizarre. They only used that for 2 months in the summer of '88, got rid of it real quick.
Yeah. But there is a connection between, like, there's a mission for Scientologists in this world, on this planet, right? And that's, they talk about clearing the planet, which is like a Scientologist version of enlightenment.
Yeah, they believe that Earth is a prison planet, being run by some invader forces, and people. It's like the Matrix. You don't realize what the reality is until you go into Scientology, and they want to take on these superhuman powers, and first clear the reactive mind, and then take on these OT powers. And they want to run the world, and so they need at least half of the world Scientologists to clear the planet and take over. They've never. I mean, it's a tiny number of Scientologists, but they believe that eventually, the idea was to take over the earth.
And clearing means getting rid of all of this, all of those engrams, getting rid of your reactive mind, becoming like a free spirit that is in charge of the body and matter.
Once you've cleared away the reactive mind and trained your OT powers, you will finally start to be able to see that whole track of existence.
and see what all these lives that you've led up to this point that are part of your faith. And the other important thing is the current situation is when this body dies, you as a Thetan are whisked away to an implant station on either Mars or Venus by these invader forces. And you're pumped full of false memories so that you forget who you were, what your life was like. Then they send you back to Earth and you go look for a baby to jump into for your next life. And you have to start over. You have to start over from scratch. You don't remember that you were a Scientologist. You don't remember anything. And you might end up in a country that country you didn't want to be part of. You know what I'm saying? It's too random. And so part of what the reason of becoming OT8, and Luis Garcia explained this really well for us last week on my blog. This was the motivation to becoming OT8, is supposedly at that point, as an operating Thetan, you will then be able to resist that between life implanting and live from lifetime to lifetime with full knowledge of who you are. So that, okay, this body's dying. I get out of it as the Thetan. I go down to the maternity ward. I jump into a baby, but I still remember who I am. I'm now starting a new life. I'm still a Scientologist. Imagine an OT8 baby. Whoa, with all these superpowers. That's the goal. That's what they're all spending $1 million for, to get that power to live lifetime to lifetime. So you can see that if that's your goal, cataclysms, end of the world, none of that makes any sense. So they're not looking for signs of an apocalypse.
One thing that I kind of don't want to touch, but I think we need to bring up, is something that was mentioned on the Leah Remini show, and that's the attitude towards children. There's this a quote that you posted on Twitter a bunch of times, where I guess they're talking about how early you can start with the practice and trying to achieve this goal of clearing yourself. Right. And that's what, 5-7 years old?
I think what Hubbard says is that he designed it or whatever to start at 5, but that the usual practice is 8. So somewhere in those years, you want your kid to start auditing and things like that. And I've talked to young second-generation Scientologists who signed Sea Org contracts at only 6 or 7 or 8 years old, billion-year contracts. So yeah, and the reason why they justify that is if it's true that you've lived millions of thousands and thousands of times, and you jump into a baby and start growing up, you're not a child. You're an ancient immortal being in this little package. And so Hubbard again and again and again in documents, I'm going to be putting some of those on in a story soon, talks about don't treat children like little immature babies. They are grown creatures in a small package. And also the other thing that's important here in this part of it is that if we're all Thetans and we're all just jumping into babies and choosing a new life, then the relationship to your mother is artificial. It's purely a physical one, not a spiritual one. And so that, okay, you jump into this baby making this person your mother this lifetime, but 4 or 5 lifetimes ago, you might have been their parent, right? And so it creates a weakening of the family bonds, because we're all just Thetans traveling through our current lifetime, and this lifetime doesn't really matter that much. We just got to dedicate ourselves to the church. And so this is how parents in the 70s and 80s and 90s found it somewhat easy to just drop their kids off down at the org and have them raised in the cadet org or the ATA or whatever it was. I talk to people today who, I just wrote a story about a woman who 3 years ago revealed to her mother that she no longer wanted to be a Scientologist, and her mother, who was a Sea Org member, said to her, "Then why did you pick this family? Why did you pick this body?" And she said, "This showed to me that my mother simply thought of me as another Scientology team member. We're all just Thetans jumping into bodies." And so that's why, and I'm not saying that there aren't Scientology families who are tight, because there are. But in general, Scientology, if you really ascribe to its way of thinking, it totally weakens the family bond.
Did I understand that? So the quote that you posted on Twitter that I mentioned just now.
Let me tell you about that quote. So I blogged Dianetics from cover to cover a few years ago, and I missed it the first time through. It's not. I think that this quote, it's making a real. It's making waves now because we're bringing it up so much. But I don't think anybody noticed it before because Dianetics is not easy to read, and I mean that in the most uncomplimentary fashion possible. It's awful. It's a turgid, vile book of awful examples of misogyny and ludicrous ideas. And I don't think many people read more than 100 pages of it because it just, even though it's like 400 pages, I don't think many people get back there. Well, one of my readers pointed out to me, and I've been trying to show as many people as possible. If you get all the way back to about page 404, it depends on which edition. The original Dianetics is on page 336, I think. The most recent one is it's 404, and that's just the way it's paginated. Hubbard talks about if a 7-year-old girl shudders at an adult man kissing her, even passionately, it's because she's got an engram. In other words, it's her problem. And
so,
it's
do I understand this correctly?
Quote.
Is it like anything, like any social interaction that brings you distress? There's no other reason for that to even be the case at any age, 7, whatever, 5.
I don't know if it's any social interaction, but Scientologists are always, if they feel uncomfortable about something, if they, have a negative reaction to something, they're always wondering if there was something earlier in their life that's being triggered. So that's natural. But the wording is so awful. I mean, he's just saying that a 7-year-old girl should not shudder at a man's kiss, even a passionate one. And if she does, it's because she's got an engram and she has some early memory that made men and kissing men bad. I mean,
And so that means in real situation, when there is since there are children who are in Sea Org, if a thing like that happens, the course of action then is for the child to go through auditing and deal with their problems and not with.
Well, I can tell you, there have been numerous cases that Lee and I have both looked into where someone was raped or someone was molested, and then once they reported it to a church, they then had to go through auditing and corrective, rehabilitation. I recently reported about the Danny Masterson rape investigation by the Los Angeles Police Department. And Danny's not been charged with anything. I want to make that clear. But, 3 Scientologist women have all come forward to the LAPD saying that Danny Masterson raped them. And they were telling the LAPD that the reason why they didn't come forward for many years was that the church was discouraging them. And one of them I reported, who I'm calling Victim B, I learned through her family family friend, rather, that once she reported that she had been raped, the Church of Scientology made her go through tens of thousands of dollars of examinations to try to find out what immoral things she had done in past lives to make her a victim in her current life. So this quote in Dianetics is shocking, and I'm not saying that all Scientologists are pedophiles. I'm not saying that Hubbard wanted them all to be pedophiles. But it is a pretty open endorsement of pedophilia right in Scientology's Bible that for some reason has gone mostly unnoticed for 50 years. And I want to make people aware of it because it's unambiguous. A 7-year-old girl, Hubbard says, should not shudder at being kissed passionately by an adult man. Imagine if you found something like that in, I don't know, some other text.
Yeah. One more thing I wanted to ask. There's a clear like it seems like one of the staples of the Church Scientology is they have this enemy in the psychiatry industry. And I've been wondering whether that's like a personal beef stemming from when you told that story last time we talked. Originally, Dianetic was supposed to be the science of the mind, and he like mailed it to the psychiatry.
And they rejected it,
Yeah. Is that like? Do you think that's just like the conclusion from that grew over the years, or is that it? At the same time, it seems to me like almost a strategic choice of an enemy, because then you have like your position yourself as again a scientific kind of approach to
in
dealing
some ways
with.
it's a smart strategic choice because, for example, Scientology and their front group that goes after psychiatry, it's called Citizens Commission on Human Rights. They're constantly writing about, how much children are being prescribed drugs like Ritalin, and
Which is a real problem.
It's a real controversy, of course, and so it's a very smart strategic choice. Is that you find that people who are advocates of a position find themselves, allied with Scientology's front groups, and so that's a strategic choice. But as far as a very important concept to understand about Scientology is how rigid it is, how fundamentalist it is. Everything is written down by Hubbard, and Hubbard has died, so they can't change anything. And Hubbard had this hatred and paranoia about the psychiatric profession, and the church has absorbed that. And many people have said the more you get into Scientology, the more you adopt L. Ron Hubbard's mind as your own. And so it's something that's always been there and always will be. Is part of being a Scientologist is this white hot hatred of the mental health industry. And of course the mental health industry doesn't care because Scientology's tiny and who cares what they think,
Yeah. All right. I ran out of the things that I wanted to ask and clarify. Is there something that we should be expecting with new stories published on your side, or maybe you have a scoop on the Leah Remini show?
I mean, I don't know when you're gonna play this back, but I've seen tonight's show, and it's really good. It's about the rise of David Miscavige. Leah's doing a great job, and there's still quite a few shows to go this season, so I'm really looking forward to what's in them. I know what's in some of them, but some of them I don't. I'm looking forward to finding out. I think there are some big things coming, but I can't talk about some of them yet.
All right. Well, sounds good. Thank you for this conversation, Tony.
Thanks for having me on again, man. Alrighty.